Hello there, and welcome back to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and today we're going to be talking all about the alliance system in Age of Sigmar. I wanted to do this video because I don't feel like we talk about the Grand Alliances a huge amount, and I wanted to talk about both how they are useful, how they can best be utilised, and some of the really good advantages and unexpected things that come out of them. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to do it. So this is how we continue our journey for Age of Sigmarch. And obviously we're going to be painting this model right here. Yes, another Chaos Knight, but they're coming along. I do hope you're enjoying seeing all these Chaos Knights being painted one by one. I'm having a great time. I hope you enjoy watching it as well. So, without further ado, let's crack on. So, for those of us who remember Warhammer Fantasy Battle, this is something which is quite hard for us to get our heads around. Allies have always been a bit of an anemic add-on which have never really worked that well in the game systems that we've had over the years. But Age of Sigmar have actually done something fantastic by introducing a way to make it work without having to compromise your army or have to sacrifice space to have things which feel more trivial or more narrative based then may actually help you in gameplay. And the important thing to remember is that when we look at it from both a narrative gameplay and a competitive style of gameplay, the allies in Age of Sigmar actually have a lot to offer. From the narrative side of things, there are the 4 Grand Alliances, which means that everything comes under one of 4 banners, which is genuinely fantastic. But also from a competitive side, there are ways to make it work within the armies because they're all designed to work together in a far more cohesive and more synergized manner. So let's get the really obvious thing about the ally system out of the way first. The most obvious way to use allies is to shore up the shortcomings in the core of your army. So this is the really obvious one. If your army specializes in one area and you need something to bolster it in other areas, then you can draw from those things within the other alliances. The most obvious examples are things such as ranged units for armies that are mostly melee focused. I'm thinking of the Skaven artillery in the Chaos Alliance that will help corner Nurgle armies for their lack of shooting, for example. Fast cavalry and heavy cavalry for armies that have either very little cavalry or no cavalry, and wizards for armies that have either very limited access to magic or only have a few very expensive sorcerers. These are all things that are really useful, and these are also things that I reckon most people have figured out by now. So if you've already come to this conclusion, that's fine, but it's worth reiterating now. But the other thing to bear in mind with this is that it does mean you can get units that don't just make up for the shortcomings in your armies, but where your army has shortcomings, those units can then excel in those areas, meaning that you aren't just having to get units that are either average or pay lots of points just to even the odds. You can get units that do this role incredibly well, and we'll get onto why that's particularly helpful a bit later on. But the second reason, which is very useful, is it helps getting access to characters with things like spells and abilities enhance your army in other ways as well. Now, one of the important rules of thumb to remember here is that normally buffs are specific to that battle tome or that army. You do occasionally get things like cross-chaos or cross-species spells and abilities, but more often than not, those things will only be buffing things from those battle tomes. So Idoneth Deepkin sorcerers will only ever normally be able to buff other Idoneth Deepkin units. It's this sort of thing which you need to bear in mind. So more often than not, the best way to use it is as an offensive tactic, whereas you're able to use spells and abilities to debuff your opponents. And of course, what this does also mean is that you are then giving yourself more options on the table and you are freeing up your army to pursue its objectives as things go by. But as I say, it's best used in offense rather than defense. And another thing, which again comes back to tying the lore and the gameplay a bit more nicely together, it has actually opened up the Grand Alliances to people and has given far greater access and far more incentive to use armies from within the Grand Alliances. It allows you to move between armies very easily. So if we stick with the Grand Alliance of Order for a second, in contrast to what I'm painting here, what you'll see straight away is between things like Idoneth Deepkin, Seraphim, Cities of Sigmar, and Stormcasts. All of those do have things which they specialise in some ways, and things which they have shortcomings on in other respects as well. Cities of Sigmar is a very interesting one because it is effectively a microcosm of the Grand Alliance of Order in one book, and in some respects it acts as a fantastic glue for other armies to move in and out of, and is itself quite useful as an allied detachment on most other armies because there's a bit of everything in there, and there's certainly going to be something that you can use from within that book on one of your armies that'll help enhance it even further. But then if we shift slightly to the Destruction Grand Alliance, we have the Sons of Behemoth, so we have giants, but if they're allied with things like the Uruk War clans, what you'll also find there is you'll be getting large monsters that are very tough to take down, fighting alongside a very combat-heavy army already. But having those bigger monsters allows them to smash through your opponent's lines, whilst you have your second wave, effectively, of equally powerful infantry able to start taking objectives, seize ground, and start mopping up your opponent's units. These are all very much speculative things, but they're all things that do help make the point that moving across the Grand Alliances does pay dividends, and there are certainly far more benefits and far more incentives to do it than there have been in previous games, or even in previous editions of other games. And then I says, it brings the narrative more into the game. If you read many of the novels and a lot of the battle tomes and the backstory, there is a very strong emphasis on cooperation that was quite present in the old Warhammer Fantasy battle lore and backstory, but never really manifested itself that clearly in the game. Whereas now you can do that, and there's, like I said, more of an incentive to do it. And it allows you to explore the system as you do it and make different choices and things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do before. Now, in a more competitive gameplay-leaning way of thinking about things, there are a few extra things that will definitely help you out. So, for one thing, if you are playing an army that's mainly melee-heavy with a couple of wizards, and then you have allied units that are ranged-based or artillery-based, then that keeps your opponent guessing. Straight away, it's very easy to look at most armies and have a pretty good sense of what they are, even if you only have a passing familiarity with it. But the second you effectively have two different armies that both operate quite differently, one as allies and one as your core detachment, then your opponent isn't going to have quite as clear an idea as to how you're going to try to achieve your objectives. Yes, there are some things that are immediately obvious, so if they see heavy cavalry, they'll get the idea that they're going to be going for melee. If it's heavy infantry units in armies that are mostly skirmisher-based or magic-based, they're going to have a pretty good idea of what they're going to try to achieve. However, the really important thing to remember in that respect is that whilst those obvious differences are there, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be obvious how you're going to make it work. If the core of your army mainly leans upon large numbers of wizards or large numbers of mounted units that are relatively fast, those heavy infantry units on the tabletop will probably be the ones who will be absorbing most of the damage. They'll be the ones at the front. They'll be distracting their heavy damage dealers, that sort of thing. And that's always good for you as a player, and it means that both in competitive and in friendly games, it'll give you a little edge to be able to get those objectives in a slightly more relaxed manner, rather than having to stress and worry about where your army shortcomings are, knowing that they're taken care of, or you can secure your primary objectives in ways that help you and work best for you. So to shift temporarily from the perspective of the gamer to the perspective of the painter, if you are starting a new army or expanding your current army, and you include allied detachments or allied units, one of the really interesting things about this, and really helpful things about this, is that it breaks up the monotony of painting. So I'm not saying that you'll get bored necessarily with painting certain units or certain colour schemes, but after a little while you do start to drift and you can get quite tired, and even I, who have painted many models over the year, sometimes struggle a little bit keeping focus. When you have units from other armies to paint, and you want to include those in your core army that you're going to be taking to wherever you play normally, with your friends, with your gaming club, or at a tournament, what it will mean is that you'll be a bit more focused, and you'll have just a little bit more to work with, and you'll probably be a little bit more on your toes with painting different models. Because when you're painting something, say for example, Idoneth Deepkin and Cities of Sigmar or Stormcast Eternals, if you're including any of those units in your army, the good thing is that you'll be switching from possibly heavily armoured units to more lightly armoured units. The aesthetic is different, the colours will be different, everything will be different moving from one to the other. So it'll break it up, it'll keep things interesting, and perhaps give you some more inspiration when you move back to the core part of your army, or when you get back to experiment with different colour schemes. That's my thoughts on the alliances. A couple of the key alliances I think we should probably take a second to acknowledge here are thus. Firstly, the entire Chaos Coalition. Now, it's well known that if you take an army that's dedicated to one of the gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, or Slaanesh, then your entire army doesn't even count as allied detachments. It just counts as all part of the same core army, giving you access to things such as relics, spells, and command traits. Now that's fantastic from the perspective of a Chaos player, because it means you don't actually go into your alliance allowance that much. Alliance allowance, that's a hard phrase to say. You don't go into it. So you can actually have Skaven, Slaves to Darkness, and Maggotkin units as the core of your army, backed up by things from the Hedonites book, or the Beasts of Chaos book, or even the Khorne book, to boost your army and give it different things. So it's a very broad coalition, and it's a broad coalition that doesn't cost you the ability to use your battle tome specific special rules or units. The next one is things like Kharadron Overlords and Sylvaneth, fast light infantry with lots of wizards to back them up, backed up by heavy flying gun platforms and artillery and heavy infantry that's quite mobile. That's another fun one. And my last one, and quite possibly one of my favourite alliances, is the Ossiarch Bone Reapers and the Flesh Eater Courts. Now, as much as that very much feels like two quite old ideas in terms of fantasy armies coming together, it really isn't, because in the past, Flesh Eaters, as they were, so Crypt Ghouls and everything that came with them, and Skeleton Warriors were all very much part of the same thing, and they fought in a very disjointed way, which is why you didn't see them fielded together that frequently. However, now that the Flesh Eater Court is now more about speed, and it's more about taking the fight to your opponents in a more aggressive way, and the Ossiarch Bone Reapers are a far more stoic, far more resilient army, but both of them have lots of wizards, so it gives you a very fast combat army that has even more wizards than you necessarily would have, with access to different spells that do different things. But as always, I leave it to you guys. What do you think of the alliance system? Are there more interesting alliances within the Grand Alliances that I haven't covered here today? Are there other things within those alliances that you think are worth exploring? Are there perhaps even alliances you don't think work together on the tabletop? But let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So, those are my thoughts on the alliance system within Age of Sigmar. I think they're really good. I look forward to hearing what you guys think about it in the comments. And whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. My videos come around on Wednesdays and Fridays, and that will be a schedule I'll be sticking to. Thank you all very much for watching. Check out the website. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.